Some stories in history sound like fiction, too ridiculous, too bizarre, too absurd to be true. Yet, they are. A war nearly broke out between the United States and Great Britain because of a pig. A Soviet officer once saved the entire planet by ignoring a computer alarm that screamed, "Nuclear war." And in 17th century Istanbul, taking a sip of coffee could literally get you beheaded. History isn't just about kings, battles, and revolutions. It's also about the strange accidents, coincidences, and human blunders that shape the world in ways no one expected. Moments where one tiny mistake, one wrong word, one curious decision nearly altered the course of civilization. In this journey through the weirdest corners of the past, we'll explore stories so strange they sound like tall tales whispered in a tavern. Wars fought over livestock, cities brought to their knees by smell, entire governments embarrassed by birds, and laughter spreading like a virus through a nation. Each of these moments reveals something deeper about human nature, our pride, our panic, our endless ability to turn chaos into history. So sit back and travel with me through time, not to meet great heroes or tyrants, but the accidents, misunderstandings, and absurdities that remind us that truth really can be stranger than fiction. Let's begin with the day a farmer shot a pig and almost started a war. The year was 1859. A quiet island in the Pacific Northwest, caught between America and the British Empire, suddenly became the most dangerous piece of land in the world because of one pig. San Juan Island lay between what is now Washington State and Canada. Both the United States and Britain claimed it. The treaty that was supposed to define their border was vague, a single sentence that failed to clarify which waterway separated the two nations. And so, both sides moved in. British settlers working for the Hudson's Bay Company established farms and ranches. American pioneers followed, building homes and staking claims. For a while they coexisted, awkwardly but peacefully, until one summer morning when an American farmer named Lyman Cutler found a pig digging through his potato patch. Cutler was furious. He grabbed his rifle and fired. The pig, owned by a British farmer, Charles Griffin, dropped dead on the spot. Griffin demanded 100 in compensation. Cutler offered 10. Neither would back down. Word spread. Officers were alerted. And within weeks, a ridiculous argument over livestock turned into a military standoff. The Americans sent troops under Captain George Pickett, who would later become infamous for Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. The British responded by dispatching warships, 3 of them, carrying over 2,000 armed men. For weeks, they faced each other across the island's hills, muskets loaded, cannons ready, waiting for someone to make the first move. Both sides braced for battle over a dead pig, and then nothing. Cooler heads prevailed. Officers on both sides realized how insane it all was. Neither nation wanted to start a war over a farm animal, so they agreed to a truce. The island would be jointly occupied until diplomats could settle the dispute. Years later, the boundary was officially drawn through the Haro Strait, giving the island to the United States. No one was killed. No shots were fired. The only casualty of the so-called Pig War was the pig. A war without bloodshed, sparked by pride and potatoes. But history wouldn't stay quiet for long, because less than a century later, another single man's decision, not to shoot, would save the entire world. Teach Soviet UCLR fails ELRMINCIDent. It was just after midnight, September 26, 1983. Inside a secret Soviet bunker near Moscow, one man stared at a glowing red screen and held the fate of humanity in his hands. His name was Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. His job was simple in theory, horrifying in practice: to monitor early warning satellites for signs of a U.S. nuclear launch. If an attack was detected, his duty was to report it, and the Soviet Union would respond instantly with its own nuclear arsenal. That night, alarms suddenly blared through the control room. The computer screamed one word: launch, then another, and another. 5 U.S. missiles, according to the system, were now streaking across the sky toward the Soviet Union. Petrov froze. The Cold War had reached its most paranoid peak. Only weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down a Korean passenger jet. President Reagan had called the USSR the evil empire. Both sides were on hair, trigger alert, ready to end the world in minutes. Protocol demanded that Petrov report the attack immediately. Within moments, hundreds of Soviet missiles would be launched in retaliation, the beginning of nuclear Armageddon. But something felt wrong. 5 missiles. That didn't make sense. The U.S. would never start a nuclear war with 5 missiles. A real first strike would involve hundreds, thousands, to guarantee destruction. Petrov took a deep breath. He ignored the alarms. He waited. Minutes crawled by like hours. Every second could have been his last. He watched the clock, the radar, the trembling technicians. No flashes appeared on radar, no explosions. Finally, the alert faded. The satellites had been fooled. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had triggered a false alarm. Because Petrov hesitated. Because he disobeyed orders and trusted his instincts. The world was spared from a nuclear nightmare. He didn't receive medals or fame. The event was classified for years. When it finally became public, historians quietly agreed, Stanislav Petrov may have single-handedly saved the human race. A single man's calm in chaos prevented the end of civilization. But centuries earlier, another ruler faced a very different kind of fear. Not of missiles, but of mugs. Because in the Ottoman Empire, even drinking coffee could get you killed. Ottoman Istanbul, 1633. The city that never slept, not because of noise or chaos, but because of coffee. By day, merchants crowded the bazaars. By night, philosophers, poets, and rebels gathered in small candlelit rooms, sipping the dark, bitter drink that had become the heartbeat of Ottoman life. Coffee had arrived from Yemen a century earlier, and it changed everything. It wasn't just a drink, it was a revolution in a cup. Coffee houses became hubs of conversation, art, gossip, and politics. Men would spend hours debating theology or mocking the government, shielded by the aroma of roasted beans and the illusion of freedom. But one man hated it, Sultan Murad IV. He ruled with iron discipline and a short temper. He believed that coffee houses were breeding grounds for rebellion, where ideas brewed stronger than any beverage. And so, he decided to crush the movement, not with reason, but with fear. Murad issued a decree. Drinking coffee was now punishable by death. He saw the gathering of citizens as a threat to his control. Too many voices, too many thoughts, and too little obedience. The Sultan's spies roamed the streets, searching for the scent of roasted beans. According to legend, Murad would disguise himself as a commoner, sword in hand, stalking the alleys of Istanbul at night. If he caught someone sipping coffee, the punishment was swift, beheading on the spot. And yet, people couldn't resist. The craving for conversation and caffeine was stronger than fear. Secret coffee houses emerged behind wooden doors, with lookouts at the windows. Some historians claim Murad himself was secretly addicted, drinking the very beverage he banned. Later rulers softened the law, but not by much. A first offense meant a beating. A second offense, being sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. Imagine that all for a cup of coffee. Eventually, by the 18th century, the bans dissolved. Coffee houses re-emerged openly, and Istanbul once again buzzed with conversation. But for decades, an entire city had lived in quiet rebellion, risking their lives for a simple sip of freedom. It's strange to think that a drink we take for granted once symbolized danger and defiance. And yet, centuries later, another government would outlaw something equally innocent, not coffee, but kissing. Because in early 20th century France, even love was a cause for delay. No que se garantare I am Stasioens France, the land of romance, poetry, and passion, a place where love was never hidden but celebrated. Yet in the early 1900s, the nation of kisses did something truly unthinkable. It banned kissing at train stations. The year was 1910, and trains were still the beating heart of modern life. Steam hissed across the platforms, porters shouted, and lovers stood locked in tearful embraces as whistles signaled departures. Travel was still something dangerous, uncertain. Each farewell felt like it could be the last. Couples would cling to each other until the final second, lips pressed together, ignoring the conductor's shouts to move. Trains left late, sometimes minutes, sometimes half an hour behind schedule, all because love refused to let go. At first, railway officials tried to be patient, but chaos began to grow. Crowds clogged the platforms, luggage piled up, and the schedules, sacred to the new industrial world, began to crumble. And so, in an act that sounds more like satire than law, France officially banned kissing on train platforms. Signs were posted across the country. Défense d'embrasser sur la quai. No kissing on the platform. Station masters were instructed to blow whistles or even fine couples who lingered too long. The law's goal wasn't to kill romance, only punctuality's enemy, passion. Still, the irony was too delicious to ignore. France, the world's symbol of love, outlawed its favorite expression in the very place where emotions ran deepest. Newspapers mocked it. Cartoonists drew lovers sneaking behind train cars. Some even said the law made goodbyes more dramatic. Forbidden fruit always tastes sweeter. In truth, enforcement was rare. Most officers turned a blind eye, and the ban became more of a national joke than a real threat. But officially, the rule stayed on the books for decades, a strange relic of a time when progress tried to tame the human heart. It wasn't until much later that people learned to laugh about it. Because, really, who could ever control love, especially in France? And yet, while the French were busy trying to stop kisses, the British faced a far worse problem. A crisis so foul it nearly shut down their government. Because one hot summer in London the River Thames began to rot. T.G. Stanko F. Londell, London, summer of 1858, the capital of the most powerful empire on earth, brought to its knees by its own filth. The sun was relentless that year, burning down on the River Thames, a river that had, for centuries, been treated less like water and more like a sewer. Every bucket of waste, every dead animal, every industrial runoff, all of it ended up there. London's population had exploded to over 2 million people, but its sewage system hadn't kept up. The Thames, once a proud symbol of trade and life, had become a thick, bubbling stream of decay. When the heat wave hit, the river transformed into something out of a nightmare. Temperatures soared past 32°C, or 90 F, unbearable for London. The water turned dark brown, almost black, and the stench began to crawl through the streets. People described it as a mix of rotten meat, sulfur, and death. It became known as the Great Stink. Parliament, which stood right on the riverbank, suffered the most. Lawmakers tried everything, drenching curtains in chloride of lime, burning incense, even soaking rags in perfume and pressing them to their faces. But nothing worked. The smell was too powerful. It seeped through the windows, choking anyone who tried to work. One member of Parliament wrote, "The air is not only offensive to smell, but dangerous to health." And he was right. Cholera outbreaks, caused by the same polluted water, had already killed tens of thousands across the city. But it wasn't death that finally forced action, it was the unbearable smell. For years, the government had ignored pleas for a modern sewage system, calling it too expensive. But the Great Stink made inaction impossible. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a brilliant civil engineer. He designed an ambitious underground sewer network, over 1,000 miles of tunnels to carry waste away from the city. Construction took years, but when it was done, it changed London forever. The Great Stink faded into history, but its legacy remained. The birth of modern sanitation. It's strange, isn't it? An empire that ruled the seas, conquered continents, and built railways across the world, finally defeated by the smell of its own river. But while London battled its stink, another empire halfway across the globe faced a very different kind of invasion. Because in 1932, Australia went to war not against birds. The Gradiema War Australia, 1932. The Great Depression had left the country wounded, farms failing, food scarce, and thousands of soldiers recently returned from World War I struggling to rebuild their lives. The government had offered them land in Western Australia to grow wheat. But there was one small problem: they weren't alone. That year, as the dry season ended, 20,000 emus, tall, fast, flightless birds, migrated from the coast into the newly settled farmland. To them, the wheat fields looked like paradise, endless food and open space. To the farmers, they were a plague. The emus tore through fences, devoured crops, and trampled whatever they didn't eat. Farmers tried scaring them off, but it was useless. The birds didn't care about shouting or gunfire. So the veterans who'd fought real wars now begged the government for military help. And the government agreed. They didn't send scarecrows, they sent soldiers, armed with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Major GPW Meredith and his men were dispatched to fight an enemy unlike any they'd ever faced. At first, confidence was high. The plan was simple: herd the emus into groups, open fire, and be done in days. But the emus had other plans. They were fast, faster than any soldier expected, and coordinated, splitting into smaller flocks and scattering across miles of open land. Bullets flew, dust rose, and yet the birds kept running. Even when a machine gun jammed or a truck broke down, the emus seemed to vanish into the scrub, only to reappear somewhere else. The soldiers fired thousands of rounds, and barely killed a few hundred birds. The rest escaped. By the end of the campaign, Major Meredith had to admit defeat. He told reporters that the emus had the invulnerability of tanks. The press laughed, the public mocked, and the episode went down in history as the Great Emu War, a battle in which the mighty Australian army was humiliated by birds. Eventually, farmers built stronger fences and the emus moved on. But the story stuck, a reminder that sometimes nature wins. A ridiculous war, fought in earnest, and lost to the wind. But if you think that's absurd, wait until you hear about what happened in Boston, when a flood of molasses drowned an entire neighborhood. Molasses followed Boston, January 1919. The air was cold, the harbor quiet, and the streets of the North End, home to dock workers and immigrants, smelled faintly sweet. No one knew that within minutes that sweetness would turn into death. At the edge of the neighborhood stood a massive iron tank, 50 feet tall, holding over 2 million gallons of molasses. The syrup was used by the Purity Distilling Company to make industrial alcohol, and the tank towered over the street like a metal giant. It had leaked for months, groaning and oozing dark streaks down its sides. But no one did anything. Whenever residents complained, the company's solution was simple: paint the tank brown so the leaks wouldn't show. On the afternoon of January 15th, as the sun warmed the metal and fermentation built pressure inside, the tank began to tremble. At 12:30 p.m., it exploded. Witnesses described a thunderous roar, like a train derailing underground. Then came the wave. A wall of molasses, 25 feet high and moving 35 miles per hour, tore through the streets of Boston. It smashed houses, flipped trucks, crushed horses, and ripped a steel bridge from its supports. People were swept away instantly, trapped in syrup so thick it was impossible to move. One survivor recalled, "It caught everything human or animal like flies on flypaper." When rescuers arrived, they found the streets glistening dark brown, silent, except for the faint, bubbling sound of molasses settling. It took weeks to clear the wreckage. Horses had to be shot where they stood, frozen in the sticky sea. Some victims suffocated, others drowned slowly as the syrup hardened around them. 21 people died and over 150 were injured. The cleanup lasted for months. Workers sprayed salt water from fireboats to dissolve the sugar. Even decades later, locals swore that on hot days, the neighborhood still smelled faintly of molasses. Investigations revealed the truth. The tank had never been tested for safety. It was built cheaply, its rivets too weak to hold the weight inside. The company's greed had literally burst at the seams. The Great Molasses Flood became a strange legend, part tragedy, part dark comedy, A disaster so absurd it sounds made up, yet entirely real. And while Boston drowned in syrup, another city, across the ocean, would soon face a disaster just as bizarre. A flood of beer. La Dr flowed London, October 17, 1814. The smell of hops drifted through the streets of St. Giles, the brewery district, where enormous vats held rivers of dark porter beer. Inside the Mix and Company brewery, workers went about their day, unaware that one of those vats was about to make history. It stood 22 feet tall and held over 300,000 gallons of beer, enough to fill thousands of barrels. A single iron hoop, cracked and weakened, was all that held the pressure in. It wasn't unusual, the vats groaned and leaked all the time. Workers had learned to ignore it. But just before evening, that iron band snapped. The pressure inside the giant barrel became unstoppable. Within seconds, the vat exploded, a cannon blast of iron and foam. The force shattered the back wall of the brewery. A tidal wave of beer, 15 feet high, thundered through the streets. It tore down walls, smashed through houses, and crashed into crowded basements. One of those basements held a family hosting a funeral wake. In an instant, mourners were swept away by thousands of gallons of porter. The flood flattened 2 homes, filled cellars, and even knocked over a pub wall. Locals later described seeing beer pouring through the streets like a brown river, carrying furniture, barrels, and people. 8 lives were lost that day, all drowned or crushed by the wave of beer. Rescuers waded knee-deep in porter, dragging out survivors and bodies alike. The brewery district reeked of alcohol for days. The aftermath was grim but surreal. Crowds gathered with buckets, trying to collect free beer from the gutters. Some drank it straight from the street, only to fall ill soon after. When the courts investigated, the verdict was astonishing: an act of God. The brewery wasn't held responsible. It rebuilt and continued operating, with new vats standing exactly where the old ones had burst. The London beer flood became one of history's strangest disasters. A tragedy drowned in irony. A city that loved its drink had been consumed by it. It would take more than a century before another bizarre confrontation would rival its absurdity. One involving 2 superpowers, hundreds of soldiers, and a single tree. Because in 1976, in the most heavily guarded border on Earth, the United States and North Korea nearly went to war over pruning a tree. Busan, Korea, August 1976. The demilitarized zone, a narrow strip of land dividing north and south, was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Tension hung in the air like fog, every movement watched through binoculars, every sound echoing the memory of a war that had never officially ended. At the heart of that frozen border stood a single poplar tree. It blocked the line of sight between 2 United Nations checkpoints near the Bridge of No Return. American and South Korean officers decided it needed trimming, a small, harmless task, or so it seemed. On August 18, Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett led a work party of soldiers and engineers to cut back the branches. They were unarmed, carrying only axes and saws. But soon, a group of North Korean soldiers approached, 20, then 30, led by a captain shouting orders. Within minutes, words turned to rage. The North Koreans claimed the tree had been planted by their great leader himself. When the Americans refused to stop, chaos erupted. The soldiers attacked, swinging clubs and tools. In the violence that followed, Boniface and Barrett were beaten to death. The others barely escaped. For 3 days, both sides braced for war. The United States considered bombing the area, even nuclear retaliation. But then came a plan as bizarre as it was brilliant: Operation Paul Bunyan. Named after the legendary lumberjack, it was a mission to send a message, through spectacle, not bloodshed. At dawn on August 21, the U.S. and South Korea returned to the site, this time with overwhelming force. Engineers with chainsaws moved in to cut down the tree, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers, all fully armed. Overhead, helicopters hovered loaded with commandos. Nearby, B-52 bombers flew low across the DMZ. F-4 Phantoms roared through the sky, Tanks rolled into position. Artillery was locked and ready. In total, over 800 troops took part in what was essentially the world's most intimidating landscaping job. Across the border, stunned North Korean soldiers watched, hands on their weapons, unsure what to do. They didn't fire a single shot. Within an hour, the tree was gone, cut down to a stump. The message was clear. The U.S. could unleash unimaginable power if provoked. Operation Paul Bunyan ended without another casualty, but it remains one of the most surreal shows of force in modern history. A reminder that sometimes the smallest spark can almost start a war. And yet, not all strange outbreaks in history came from violence. Some came from laughter, because in 1962, in a small village in Africa, people began laughing and couldn't stop. It began as madness often does, with a giggle. January 30, 1962, a girls' boarding school in the village of Kashasha, in what was then Tanganyika's modern-day Tanzania. 3 students started laughing during class. No one thought much of it. Maybe they were joking, maybe they'd gone stir-crazy from exams. But the laughter didn't stop. Minutes turned into hours. Then others joined in. Within days, the sound of uncontrollable laughter filled the school halls. Teachers shouted for silence, but their words were drowned out by fits of giggling that rolled through the dormitories like a storm. 95 of the school's 159 students were soon infected, though infected is the wrong word because no disease was found. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was desperate. Girls doubled over, clutching their stomachs, tears streaming down their faces. Some collapsed, shaking. Others screamed between bursts of laughter, unable to breathe. The episodes could last hours, even days. When exhaustion finally silenced one group, another would start again. The school tried everything: prayers, doctors, even closing classes, but nothing worked. Eventually, administrators had no choice but to shut the entire school down. The girls went home and the laughter followed them. Soon, neighboring villages began to experience the same phenomenon. Parents, siblings, even teachers started laughing uncontrollably. The epidemic spread across the region like wildfire. Over 1,000 people affected, 14 schools closed, entire communities paralyzed by laughter. And yet, no virus, no poison, no gas leak. So what happened? Scientists later called it mass psychogenic illness, a form of mass hysteria triggered by extreme stress. Tanganyika had just gained independence from Britain. For the first time, the nation's youth were caught between strict traditional values at home